I want some. No? Okay, suit yourself. It's delicious though, in case you were wondering. Yeah, it's crisp, it's not too sweet, and beyond that, look at how beautiful it is. This green fades into an ombre red and has a spray of speckles right here. It makes you wonder where one color starts and the other one ends. I've always loved that about apples. Yeah, they're like nature's candy. All these different shades of yellow, red, and green. The colors that immediately draw our attention. Have you ever seen an apple tree ripe with fruit? No. That's not surprising, but when they are, they have these impossibly full branches of perfect dark green oval leaves that get so full and heavy with fruits that they look like giant clusters of berries. Well, that's why I brought you here, because I want you to see and visit with an old friend of mine. An apple tree that's been on this island since long before us humans gave it a name that we understood. Yeah, I needed you to come here and feel this ancient apple tree and her mottled bark and see her twisted branches so you understand what I mean when I talk about her. Why? Well, because you see, most apple trees, in my opinion, look a bit scraggly. You know, they look kind of all over the place, especially the younger ones. Well, their new branches kind of grow up and out, and they eventually make a pretty rounded canopy, but until then, it kind of looks like Einstein's hair, but for trees. Until they get older, anyways. Apples are, they're pretty short and, stout comparatively. And they age and their trunks turn into this chunky, stout base. Really thick, really sturdy. And the canopy will continue to get more tangled and more dense on their own, but when they have a little bit of help from a friend, the correct care can keep an apple tree fruiting for a really long time. Like a really long time. On their own, they only fruit for about 50 years, but with the right care, they can just keep fruiting. Which is why I'm here. I'm part of the order that prunes and keeps this ancient apple tree going. Oh, I don't know how old she is. That's a question for elements much, much more ancient than I. Anyways, we call her Grandmother Apple. I needed to go check on her, see how she's doing after the big storm we just had, and I thought perhaps we could pay her a visit together. And while I do, I thought maybe she would share her story with you. What do you say? That's what I thought you would say. Wonderful. Let's go. All right, here we are. I know. Isn't she a sight to see? Yeah. Take as much time as you need, and when you're ready, go and choose an apple. Find a safe place to lean against her hefty trunk, and when you're ready, don't be shy. She wants to share all of her story with you as deeply as you'd like to meet it, and believe me, it's a juicy one. So, when you're ready, find a spot and take a bite. Hello, listener, and thank you for joining me today on Wish Crafting. My name is Wish. I'm so happy to be here with you. I took a mini break from the podcast, partially to write this hefty, chunky episode, and partially because life things called for that, and that's okay. But I'm happy to be back here with you today. Happy to be crafting today's story of Apple, Malus domestica. And her story is one like so many others that intrigue me that takes us far and wide when searching for her truth. Listener, what do you think of when I say the word apple? What stories do you tell? Maybe stories of juice boxes that were treated like literal gold in elementary school, or a bitter cold, wet morning in autumn making applesauce in an antique applesauce press with your Nana, while you both hold a mug of fresh, hot apple cider to warm you? Or is it the story of a caterpillar who couldn't eat his fill? Is it rolling hills of young apple trees still thick with radiant red fruit even after filling bucket after bucket after bucket? Or is it a scene of a fall festival? Children playing and the smell of hay and newly trimmed grass filling your nose as your tiny hands reach up to grab the biggest, reddest apple you have ever seen, coated in a green candy so thick and shiny that it looks like the apple has been dipped in green glass. Or perhaps it's the smell of a celebratory cup of tea, or a brand new candle drifting to you through the warm shafts of light as you wrap yourself in your softest blanket. Or do you think of Eve and her liberation, the snake magic and feminine power of the most infamous story in the world? Do you think of stories and how they confront the line and cause empires to rise and fall, just like in Homer's Odyssey, when Chaos herself throws a golden apple into a crowd of goddesses and triggers the grandest epic of all time? Do you think of the ever-present pull of lust, beauty, and validation showcased by the appearance of a poison apple in the tale of Snow White? Maybe you don't, because these are the vast array of images and scenes that are conjured within me when apple is the focus. But maybe you do, because apples are just as global as they are personal. In the intro, I compared the spirit tree of Grandmother Apple to the crone, and I do so with the most respect and reverence possible, because I'm not just alluding to her gnarled appearance and old age, or her deep roots, which, by the way, can get up to 17 feet deep by their third year, which is impressive to say the least. Anyways, when I refer to the Grandmother Apple as the crone, it is with respect. When it comes to the green spirits of the earth that have been human allies, Apple is one of the most loyal and enduring. Approximately 750 years ago, in the Paleolithic era, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers discovered the ancestor to today's apple. It was in what is now known as modern Kazakhstan in Central Asia. And in Central Asia, apples are still revered as a symbol of fertility. In Kazakhstan, the beginning place of our journey with apple, a relatively modern practice of women lying under apple trees to increase their chances of fertility is still pretty prominent and actually pretty new and modern. Apple is still part of many living traditions in Asia, where 8,000 years ago, Neolithic farmers began the cultivation of wild apples. And around 4,000 years ago, along the Nile, the first domesticated apples that we know today were being cultivated and turned into orchards. This is a stunning timeline. She's been with us a very long time, and just to share a little bit more of the botany with you, because it's amazing, apple cultivation is a truly wondrous thing, because each time you plant an apple seed, the tree and fruit it produces is unique, influenced by the region and the climate that it's planted in. And this is why there are over 8,000 distinct apple varieties in the world. 8,000 distinct apple varieties in the world. The apple varieties that we have in the grocery store are grown through grafting, which is like creating a Frankenstein tree to make sure that you get the fruit that you want. So you take the base of any old apple tree and you put the top of the apple variety you want on it and you grow it like that. And if you want to know more about the science of growing apples, please go listen to the pomology episode of the Ologies podcast, where you can learn all of that and more about the science of apples, because they explain it way better than I ever will. But for now, let's get back to the juicy bits of Grandmother Apple. And with 750,000 years of known history, there are a lot of juicy bits. We could spend ages talking about Granny Apple and only barely scratch the surface, but I'm going to share what I know and start with that, and we'll call that a good start, okay? Apples, to me, are one of the most magical trees to work with, especially for our witches and pagans, because if you were to cut straight down the middle into any apple right now, you would see that the seeds and core arrange themselves in a 5-pointed star pattern. The flowers, besides smelling delightfully like honeysuckle and fruit, also have 5 petals arranged in such a way. For this reason alone, a dried slice of apple can make a most excellent talisman to be attuned to really whatever you'd like. Fun fact, which you will already know if you have listened to the pomegranate episode, the word for apple in French is pomme. P-O-M-M-E, pomme. The word pomme comes from the Latin word pomus, and that word originally meant fruit. And then later it was used to mean apple, and the symbol of an apple and the word for apple both just meant fruit, until way later. In other words, apple meant apple, but it also simply meant fruit as a catch-all term, which is super interesting when you consider how many stories of antiquity involve apples. This will come back in later, so remember that, okay? Apples were, like most of us, part of my everyday life from early on, both in the mundane everyday, as well as the celebratory seasonal foods, festivals, and fun of my 2 favorite holidays since my birth, Halloween and Christmas. And yeah, apple season starts in the fall here in the U.S., at least, but they can't really be confined to a season because apples are a year-round staple for most of us. However, they are openly invited into our celebration rites around the autumnal equinox, or nowish, and they stay in that elevated seat until the new year comes around. Is that because they pair perfectly with the spices of the season? Maybe. Or maybe it's because for a very long time they have been the final harvested crop. That probably has something to do with it, for sure. In other parts of the world, the apple celebrations start in August. In Ukraine and Russia, they have a holiday called the Apple Feast of the Savior, which is the East Slavic folk version of the Feast of Transfiguration, one of 3 Orthodox Christian feast days that celebrate Jesus. On these feast days, food is blessed to represent something else, as is common in Christianity. And on this particular feast, the Apple Feast of the Savior, apples are blessed to represent the transformation of Jesus after crucifixion, to represent his earthliness to full, transcendent, holy being. They are blessed in the church, and then they are taken into folks' homes and made into seasonal dishes. In this particular way, apples represent blood. They represent the elevation of spirit over sin, very interestingly, if you ask me. And they represent the literal spirit of God. In Ukraine, they celebrate this feast on August 6th, and in Belarus and Russia, they celebrate on August 16th. Slavic countries are really interesting to look at when it comes to the Christian assimilation of traditions, because a lot of them have really clear paths to their roots, which is actually fairly unique. which is the case with this feast day. The pre-Christian tradition of the Feast of Apples comes from the Byzantine Empire Feast of Grapes. Now, the Byzantine Empire never ruled Russia, but they directly influenced nearly everything we view as stereotypically Russian today. Okay, so that being said, grapes are not super easy to grow in Russia. And the Feast of Grapes, a feast that celebrated the turning of the seasons and the beginning of autumn, turned into the Feast of Apples in Russia and the immediately surrounding Eastern Slavic regions. In the pagan version of this holiday, there was a procession through the town and the fields and the harvests as well as the homes, and they would all be blessed. And then the harvested fruit of the sacred day after the blessing would be turned into a feast that was celebratory and honorary in nature, which sounds quite lovely. Another celebration with apples at the center is a festival celebrated in both Cornwall and Wales, and that is the one called Allantide. Allantide, or the Feast of St. Allen, which is the Christianized version of the festival of All Hallows Tide. And that might ring a little teeny tiny bell in your noggin, because it should, because that is All Hallows Eve, October 31st, Halloween. I tried really hard to find why St. Allen was the one who subsumed this particular day, and did not get very far. It was almost like, because Halloween has always been the darling of everyone everywhere, the church was like, well, we can't get rid of this day. We can't throw it away because the people love it too much. It's too important. So they just kind of went down the list of Cornish saints and found one whose name matched as close as possible. And they're like, no. Alan. Yes, that'll do. And they just threw him on there. If you look him up, he literally has nothing to his name, no accomplishments, no anything. He was just born in Cornwall a long time ago, and that was St. Allen. So they called it Allantide when they Christianized it, and today we're going to refer to it as All Hallows Tide to honor its pagan roots, because just like the Feast of Apples we just spoke of, it has some pretty direct history to its pagan origins. That's the right word. Pagan origins. So, yeah, we're just going to call it All Hallows Tide while I tell you about it, okay? Because that's better anyways, right? So, after All Hallows Tide became Allantide, nothing really changed. All of their traditional activities stayed the same, except one cool thing. Across Europe, at least, Halloween has always been a time of communing with the ancestors, okay? We know this. The veil is thin and all of that, because canonically, this is the time that they would come visit, or we would go visit them. The darkness is closer, death itself was closer, because not everyone would make it to the next spring in antiquity, like in all honesty. So historically, thoughts around this time turned to survival and everything that meant. So it definitely makes sense that with the beginning of winter, because that's really what this day celebrated, was the first day of winter. With the coming of winter was the coming of death. And instead of acting in fear, they celebrated this time and invited the beloved dead in to make peace with the truth of what this time period was, right? So the one thing that the church added into the All Hallows Tide festivities was the ringing of the bells. Church bells would ring out on this day to both comfort and guide the Christian souls in Hades. In early centuries, the church adopted this name, Hades, from the Greek belief that the underworld was called Hades to describe the place that souls awaited their final judgment, the place between heaven and hell, otherwise known as purgatory. So, to put it another way, early Christians definitely believed in a spirit realm or an intermediate state, purgatory, and in Cornwall at least, on All Hallows Tide, churches rang their bells to ring comfort into the souls waiting in line to get to heaven, basically. And I wanted to include this because not only is it fascinating, but the mystical nature of early Christianity that has been lost to us today blows my freaking mind when you see how magic and witchcraft is received by your everyday Christian. And I think it's so funny. So I have to include it in there. However, All Hallows Tide is still the preferred holiday over the modern Halloween, which I love. Apples are still alive and kicking in the living folklore of the area. And that's amazing. Because apples are smack in the middle of All Hallows Tide and their pagan celebrations. The tradition of giving Allen apples for good luck to the people that you love is kind of the heart of this holiday. Allen apples are specifically bright red, and they're highly polished apples given like tokens and talismans of love and luck to the people that are really close to you in your life. And they would be placed in places of honor where they were able to be seen and enjoyed for a long time in the home. Unless you were a child and had Allen games that you would play with your Allen apple, and sometimes this included putting it in other places that were maybe a little bit more sneaky or more hidden. There were also lots of apple-centered games. One of the more interesting ones being a kind of bobbing for apples, but instead of water, the apples were suspended on a wooden cross, and on top of the cross, candles were placed towards the outside on like the outer edges of the cross. And the penalty for not getting your apple quickly enough was hot wax to the face. Other apple activities were centered around divination, where older girls would sleep with their Allen apples underneath their pillows and hope to dream of their future spouse. Or, you've probably heard of this one, peeling an apple in a continuous peel and then tossing the peel over your shoulder to see what letter the peel would showcase once it landed on the ground. And that letter was supposedly the first letter of their future partner. Other divination games were played on this day as well, like tossing walnuts into the fire to determine passion or fidelity or other things that you might want to know. Or the game where hot metal was poured into water to divine the future through the cooled shapes, a lot like we do today with wax in water. Games tinged with practical jokes and divination, those definitely capture the spirit of the Halloween season. However, All Hallows Tide did have that element of communing and acknowledging the dead. And on this day of All Hallows Tide, folks would bury apples outside of their front door as gifts and sustenance for the dead. But this connection between apples and the dead doesn't stop in Cornwall or Wales, oh no. In other Celtic countries and countries across Europe, tombs with petrified apples going back nearly 7,000 years are not uncommon. Outside of Europe rests the tomb of ancient Queen Puabi in the city of Ur. This city was one of the great cities of ancient Sumer or Mesopotamia, and this queen and her garland of apple slices were entombed a cool 4,500 years ago. In this tomb were cylinders that held tablets of the queen's name and other important information, but on one of these cylinders was Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, the Sumerian Queen of Heaven, and my girl. It was common in that time to invoke gods by calling out hymns that sang their praises, and one such hymnal found for Inanna was a hymn that reads, You are the creator of apples in their clusters. Yet another hint that this fruit holds divine connection. Apples have been found in many Bronze Age burials across the Middle East and Mediterranean, and even in Norway, a Viking burial that included an entire longship, which was common for Viking burials, had a whole barrel of petrified crab apple slices, or crab apples, placed upon the ship with other valuable and practical goods for the person buried there. So, a whole barrel of apples. That tells you just how important and valuable apples were. And to the Norse people in particular, apples were actually really important because in the Old Norse religion, apples represented wisdom, love, and immortality. The goddess Eden, or Idun, was known as the keeper of apples, and she was the sacred guardian of the golden apples that kept the Norse gods eternally youthful. If you were to do some surface Googling around Eden and her story, you'd find that it isn't the best story, as is often the case with the gods, no matter where the myth originates. The gods were gods and usually kind of shitty, but anyways, here it goes. The story goes that Loki wanted something from the giant Thiassi, so long story short, Loki traded Idun, who was known as the Maiden of the Gods, for her youthful beauty. She was known as the Maiden of the Gods because she had really bright, vibrant, youthful looks. And that was shown in art through her loose, long, golden hair, or in stories through her loose, long, golden hair that matched her golden apples, right? So the giant took Idun to his hall, and very quickly the gods started to wither away because without her apples of eternal youth, they began to age and fade. Because what Loki hadn't realized is that Idun kept the apples, the golden apples, on her at all times, and the apples themselves weren't necessarily the magic. The enchanted apples were the magic. So he realized that it was her magic that was keeping them young, right? Her and the apples working together was keeping the gods in eternal youth. So basically, they were screwed because she was gone. So Loki borrowed Freya's magical cloak that helps her shapeshift into a falcon, and he shapeshifted into a falcon, flew into the Hall of Giants, and changed Idun into a nut, which he then grabbed in his talons and flew back to the Hall of the Gods. The giant gave chase, of course, and ended up dying, which in itself sets off the revenge story of his daughter, but that is another story in entirety. So I just think it's funny that Loki goes in there and he's all like, don't be suspicious, don't be suspicious. And then comes back and he's just like, just kidding, here she is, I fixed it. Anyways, Idun goes back to her goddess business and her goddess form and continues to give the gods and goddesses the apples of eternal youth. By her good grace, might I add. She's very forgiving. And this story is a legit story. It comes from the Poetic Eddas, and there's a lot to read between the lines here, as with most of the stories of the gods, but especially with the Eddas, right? Loki assumed that he was going to be able to find these apples, and he didn't need Idun. She didn't hold any outside power over the apples. And then after his shenanigans, realized that it's not the apples, it's not just her, it's them in combination. So go figure, you know. But however, there's a cyclical nature to this story when we look at it with a little more keen of an eye. The maiden is drawn out by Loki, surrounded by lush trees and flowers, and then she gets stolen away by the giant. And her world and the gods wither and fade without her. And finally, when she is returned as a seed, as a literal seed, the world flourishes again. And so do the gods, right? Does this sound familiar? Well, it should, because it certainly echoes that of Persephone, whose own story is one of life and death and an ode to the changing seasons, among being a coming-of-age story as well, just like Idun or Eden. I find it very interesting that the apples of eternal youth, a knowledge and magic known only to her, comes from the Garden of Eden in this very old Norse epic poem. And that little fact is not lost on me, and I don't want it to be lost on you either, okay? Keep that one in your back pocket for Thanksgiving, all right? In Greece, Hera was given an apple orchard from Gaia as a wedding gift on her wedding day to Zeus. These apples promised immortality and that one bite and you would never again be hungry, never again be thirsty, and never again face any illness, which of course meant that the golden apples were quite famous and coveted by both gods and men. In fact, Hercules' 11th labor was to retrieve 3 of these apples from Hera's orchards. Just one of these apples happened to be stolen by the goddess of chaos, Eris, who then started the Trojan War by riding to the fairest and throwing it into a group of goddesses. So, of course, Hera wanted to employ the best to guard her apples because they can cause quite the trouble. So, first, she employed the Hesperides, or the nymphs of the setting sun, and they presided over the entirety of the orchard. The Hesperides are either said to be the daughters of Atlas, the titan that holds the sky, or Nyx, the primordial titaness that is the night, right? So, the Hesperides are specifically golden hour nymphs. Okay, they're associated with the golden light of sunset, which just sounds terribly poetic if you ask me. And the fact that these nymphs, who are directly related to and of golden light, makes them a very obvious choice to guard the always fruiting apple trees with never spoiling golden fruit. They also, because of their golden light, golden energy, were set as the guards for the other treasures of the gods, right? But the apples are the ones they're the most famous for. However, Hera took extra precaution because the Hesperides had other duties as well. So, she got herself a dragon. A 100-headed dragon. In fact, named Ladon, I don't know how to say his name. We're going to go with Ladon because I'm from the south. So, Ladon, who never sleeps, has 100 heads, and is in the garden as well. You know, which, there you go, girl. Get you a dragon. Just in case, right? Now, before we move forward, there is just a little bit of speculation that Hera's golden apples were not actually the apples that we're talking about today, and instead were the fruit of the argan tree, which is just as coveted for its incredible healing of the skin and hair now as it was then in ancient Greece. So, the fruits of the argan tree, when ripe, almost look like miniature mangoes, but they are much lighter yellow that does seem to glow gold in the sun. And the bark of this tree, the argan tree, is also quite scaly, which could be why it was said that a dragon sits at the base of the apple trees, right? A poetic allusion to the bark looking a little reptilian, but that is yet to be confirmed with folks that have more authority on the matter than me. I just wanted you to know. All right? That's a bit of a reference to earlier when I said the word apple was often used to just describe fruit. This could potentially be one of those situations. But back to the apple. Not only was the apple the fruit of the gods, the fruit of the dead, and the food of the dead, it was also the food of the fae and the fruit of the fae. It was the one fruit that could lend its nature to this world and that of the other world. And in one Irish myth, a fairy maiden falls in love with a mortal man, and when the man's father sends his men to chase off the woman, she boards her crystal ship, tosses him an apple bow, and for a year, the man lives off the apples this bow produces, as it is from the other world, the realm of Fae and Fairy, and each time he picks an apple, a new one grows. So for a year, this man lives off these Fae apples, and then the woman returns, and they both get into her crystal ship, and they sail away together to live happily ever after in the other world. Another Irish tale tells of Manannán Mac Lir, who is the sea god who had a magical silver bough of apples as well. And on this silver bough of apples were either 3 or 9 apples, depending on the story. And these apples played music. Okay? And this wasn't any music. This was fairy music. So the music could rid people of their sorrows, and it could lull suffering people into a soothing sleep. Pretty cool. Anyways, Manannán Mac Lir gave the bough to the High King of Tara so that he could get from this world and the other world safely. He could move between worlds safely. And stories vary as to why and what he was doing that he needed to get in between worlds, but that's not the important part of this story right now, because the king paid a steep price for that apple bough. In order to get the bough, he traded his wife and daughters, and when they found out about his betrayal, they were obviously heartbroken. But the king just shook the bough of apples to ease their suffering, because that's what the bough of apples did. Like the king of Tara, Taliesin, a figure from Welsh mythology, and Merlin, the Merlin, both used a bough from the other world to travel between this world and that as well. A bough of apples from the fairy realm. And in the Arthurian legend, which is a living folkloric tradition of Wales, the Isle of Avalon is where the Lady of the Lake and her sisters and other fae live. It's where Morgan Le Fay brings Arthur to heal after he's mortally wounded, and it's apparently where he was last seen. And there are various places all over England that claim to be Avalon, or all over the UK that claim to be Avalon and the final resting place of King Arthur. Avalon means Isle of Apples in early Brittonic language, and it is an island where the people and plants are forever young. Yet another tie to immortality. The island is supposedly full of these magical apple trees that appear fully grown and fruit endlessly in the magical Isle of the Fae. A land full of magical fruit of immortality is probably the ideal place for the legendary King Arthur to retreat to, and perhaps his legacy that still lives on in the living tradition of the area is the immortality that he found on the elusive isle. His immortality being, forever having his legacy and his story be told in perpetuity. I have once heard of another place called the Isle of Apples, and me sharing it with you is very personal, both to me and for those who experienced it. But I do want to share it with you because I think that it is a part of my story, and I think it's very magical and fun, and I want to share it with you. So last year at Samhain, I did a series of workshops with Starhawk, who you might recognize that name because she's one of our pagan elders that paved the way for modern witchcraft today. And I was thrilled to be accepted into this workshop where we were discussing the meeting point of story, myth, and trance for folks that were facilitating rituals and circles for other people. It was an excellent course, and it was her first time facilitating it, which felt really special to be a part of the first iteration of that workshop. Our first session was on Samhain, and at the end of the session, Starhawk led us on a guided journey to somewhere called the Isle of Apples, which is a place that her and her coven go through a journey each Samhain. And I felt pretty honored, beyond honored actually, to be welcomed into this tradition. And the idea was you go to the Isle of Eternal Youth, the Isle of Apples, the place where the ancestors reside, right? And there is way more to it than that, but my experience was pretty profound, to say the least. It was also very personal, but I'm going to share it with you because you might be curious, like I definitely would be. So I'm just going to kind of free flow consciousness for this story and hope that it comes out well. So if I have a few more ums than usual, please don't hold it against me. Okay, so my journey to the Isle of Apples started crossing over a body of water. And how we crossed the body of water and the boat were all meant to be symbolic, and they definitely were for me. Instead of a boat, I had two giant manta rays take me across the water, which if you've seen Moana, you know that manta rays are symbolic of the ancestors, and so that was really special to begin the journey with. I was also dancing on their backs while we were crossing this water, and later on, after I journaled about it all, I realized that I was dancing and making shapes that were runic symbols that I could use later on, which is mystical as crap. And then when I got to the beach of the actual Isle of Apples, I was met by my mom, who passed away when I was very young, and we had a moment together. It was very touching. And then she actually started to lead me through the aisle, and this aisle was covered with full-grown, very, very abundantly fruiting trees, and they were so dense. I mean, so dense. And in between the fully grown trees were some not quite fully grown trees. I do remember seeing those. But my mom was leading me down a boardwalk style path. And as we continued on this boardwalk, I noticed that the path was lined with lanterns, or torches, excuse me. So it was lined with torches. And so while it was shadowy, we did have light on the path. And I could only see maybe 10-ish, maybe 15 feet out into the darkened forest of apple trees. So that's as far as I could see. But there were dense trees as far as I could see, for sure, on both sides. And as we continued on this forested path, I knew that I needed to stay on the boardwalk path and that going into the forest was not meant for me. Intuitively, I felt that. And then I started to realize that we were walking in a spiral. So the boardwalk path was going in a spiral. I started to realize we were spiraling towards the center of a circle. Eventually, we did get to a very open circle. The boardwalk path ended, and it was an open, very, huge sandy circle. And the sandy circle was lined with torches as well, not lanterns. I'm sorry if I'm pausing weird. I'm just trying to remember it for you now. And so I walk into the circle, and there is a bonfire in the middle of it, and my mom touches her forehead to my forehead and then steps through the torchlight circle towards the edge of where the forest and the path is, and she goes into the shadows and she's gone, right? And then from the shadow outside of the torchlight and in the apple forest steps my great-grandmother, who I never got to know. She passed away before I was born. And she and I didn't say anything. She took my hands and she touched my forehead with her forehead. And we stayed like that for a long time. And I looked into her eyes for a long time. And she looked into mine. We didn't speak. And then, same thing, she went back into the shadows. And then out of the shadows came another grandmother. I don't know which grandmother she was, but she was very Native American looking. My Nana on my mom's side is Native American. My great-grandmother, the one that came after my mom, she was Native American. She was actually bought by my great-grandpa, and that's a whole other story, but there's a lot of Native American really close in my mother line. So this grandmother, she came out of the shadows, and She was very Native American looking, and she had red face paint on her face. And it was interesting because I had been having dreams where I was doing all kinds of things with this specific face paint on my face. And it had been so often that I was actually considering trying that face paint out at a music festival I was going to soon. So when she came out wearing this face paint, that's immediately where my brain went. And some conversation happened, but I was thinking about her face paint first. And she pulls out a leather pouch full of this pigment and she paints the red face paint on my face as well. Then we had a lot of conversation, which I won't go into the details of, but about my throat and me using my voice. And she told me how to call upon the ancestors, my grandmother line, my matriarchal line, to be a pillar of strength for me when I felt like I could not use my voice properly, when I was scared or when I just needed their support. She taught me and showed me how to call upon them, and she told me that they would speak through my voice if I allowed them to when it needed to happen, and told me that I had been holding my voice back and making myself smaller for far too long now, and it was time to embrace my path, which very much so involves me using my voice. I mean, I'm here on this podcast with you. I have other projects, but I really want this podcast and my book to be successful, if I'm being honest. And I have been scared and living in some fear around that dream. And I've told myself some stories around that dream and those goals. And she really helped me work through some blockages that I had at that time in this vision. And then as we were having this conversation, me and this nameless grandmother of mine, I started to become aware that out of the shadows, thousands of my grandmothers were coming out to circle us, right? While she was teaching me how to call upon them, they come out of the shadows and they're forming a circle around us and they start chanting. And they were chanting and helping me clear and activate my throat chakra, my energy points there, and the trauma that I have around my voice and my throat, and not just in this life either. And that's enough to need a whole session on in its own. But it was really powerful to have all of my grandmothers come out of the shadows, with my mom included. My mom was there, and encircle me, and they laid hands on me, and they all chanted for the healing that I really needed at that point. I was really deep into some writer's block at that moment in time and was down on myself about it. But I was also having boundary issues with the way that I express myself in my community. So they were helping me a lot on so many different levels. It was very powerful. And weirdly enough, on the way back to the beach after this happened, my mom walked me back to the beach. And, oh my gosh, I'm going to cry. My little Frankie came and walked with me back to the beach. And I was so happy to be able to see my mom and my grandmothers, but my cat, Frankie, that passed away a couple years ago, excuse me, my sniffles, I'm sniffly now, but my Frankie was my best boy, and I loved him so much, and I still do. So having him walk with us was also very special. And right before this actual Isle of Apples experience, where she had us ground into our bodies and our astral selves, when she had us ground our bodies and then go into the astral realm, she had us start on a street. And on this street, I actually got to see my Lillian, who was my Great Dane. She passed away not so long ago. And I got to see my Lillian, and we got to say goodbye because she was my ex's dog, technically, and we had a very deep bond, and I was very, very close with her, and she saved my life a couple times, and I didn't get to say goodbye physically. So getting to say goodbye spiritually was so wonderful, so needed. So I got to start with Lillian and then end the experience with Frankie. And then the manta rays brought me back to the place that I started the journey from. And that was pretty much it. In a nutshell. There's more to it than that, but that's the gist of it. And wow, it was so moving and intense, and I cried a lot, as you might have guessed, and it was very needed. And I've gone back to the Isle of Apples since then a couple of times, and I plan on going back again this Samhain as well. And that was my Isle of Apples experience. I'm so thankful for Starhawk to allow me and my group to go there and to allow us to continue that tradition that her and her coven have done for so long. It really has changed my life in the best possible way. Now, before we talk a little bit more magic and move on to that, I have a little bit of folklore that I want to leave you with. And it's from the United States, because apples were so important to the United States. And that is of Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed is somebody I'm not going to go down into the rabbit hole on, but he's somebody that most of us here in the United States have at least heard of. And Johnny Appleseed was a real person, was a real farmer on the East Coast, or orchardsman, really, that collected apple seeds, chose to live a life really close with nature, and didn't wear very nice clothes. Honestly, people said that he wore rags and a tin pot on his head. And he did that most of his life. There are accounts from people who met him and say that he dressed that way his whole life, even though later on in his life he was quite wealthy from the apple orchards that he had started and fostered for the colonialists here in the United States. So that's pretty interesting. There are definitely some accounts that think that Johnny Appleseed was not the best figure because he capitalized before we were knee deep in capitalism. Honestly, we're probably way deeper than knees, but you know what I'm saying. But anyways, Johnny Appleseed was a orchardsman from the United States, from Ohio, that went up and down the coast and made a ton of apple orchards and paved the way for the apple here in the United States once the colonists came over. Other than Johnny Appleseed, we do have Native American stories or one particular story that's very important that involves the apple, and that is of Turtle Island. Turtle Island is the name that Native Americans had for the United States, or have for the United States. I'm sure not all Native American tribes use that same name, but Turtle Island is the one that is most famous and most well known, at least to me. And the way that this happened was that Sky Woman was in the heavens, laying underneath an apple tree, of all things, and a hole opened in the roots of the apple tree, and she fell from the sky down to earth, which was at the time primordial waters, right? Well, the animals of the ocean saw this happen, and a giant turtle came and scooped Sky Woman up onto his back, and all of the animals went down and got the soil from the bottom of the ocean and brought it and put it on Turtle's back so that Sky Woman could have a place to live and with food and whatnot. And that place became the United States, which is Turtle Island, and that's why they call it Turtle Island. But she actually was in a heavenly position, and she was laying on underneath a heavenly apple tree. So another otherworldly apple tree makes its way into Native American mythology as well, which I just think is really interesting. So didn't want to leave that out for you guys as well. But let's get on to the magic part of apple, even though you might have some ideas at this point in the episode. Okay, so Susan Tuttle, who is the author of Green Witch Magic, says that if you bury 13 apples on Halloween night, you ensure a hearty crop come harvest. However, most witches are not farmers. At least modern witches aren't farmers, and harvesting usually ends by November. So, how could you alter this idea to suit your needs? This plant 13 apple seeds on Halloween night and ensure a hearty crop come harvest. Well, we're not really harvesting physical things most of the time, especially in the wintertime here. So I kind of altered this. And I was thinking, what 13 seeds can you sow on Samhain to tend to this winter? Because most seeds, real seeds, need a period of cold stratification to actually do what they need to do when the weather warms and spring comes back around. So what 13 seeds can you sow on Samhain that you can tend to this winter that you would like to see sprout up from the earth once the frozen ground thaws? How will you nurture these seeds through the cold and the dark? Think about this, and it could be as simple as you'd like or as complicated as you'd like. And the invitation with apple is always open, so just take that into consideration as well. But I do have a spell here for you. So anything that you'd like to grow, expand, or attract into your life around apple's correspondences of love, beauty, youth, immortality, knowledge, liberation, luck, wealth, divinity, autonomy, strength, boundaries, or truth will be very potent in a apple working. So start to consider this now and write them out as clearly as you can. All 13 seeds, so 13 intentions, right? You're going to write out 13 intentional seeds that you're going to be metaphysically planting on Samhain. So start gathering your seeds now, and then while you're considering your intentional seeds, if you can, gather actual seeds from apples, which is about 3 apples, because there's 5 seeds in each apple. So about 3 apples worth of seeds. And when Samhain rolls around, lovingly, as if you're talking to your best friend, tell the seeds your intentions that you've been working on from now to until Samhain, and bury them one at a time. It can be in the same hole, and if you don't have a place to actually bury them, dropping them into a fire or putting them on your altar in a sacred space for the cold season will do just fine. If you put them onto your altar, make sure you keep them in a blessed receptacle or in a place of honor, okay? So now, right now, begin forming your intentions, your 13 seeds, and on Samhain, you're going to gather your written intentions and your actual physical seeds and put them one by one into wherever you've decided their resting place is going to be for the winter time. So it's going to be whisper your intention, drop a seed. Whisper your next intention, drop the next seed for all 13. And once you're done, you can say this spell as you bury or place your seeds. And if you're placing them, it'll be your final seed that you say this with. And if you're burying them, you'll say this as you're putting the soil on top of your hole. Okay? And here's the spell. North, south, east, west. Apple seeds are found. North, south, east, west. This working goes to ground. Through the dark, through the cold, brought up from below, strong like the apple tree, this magic here will grow. When once again the winter fades and green returns to play, the apple magic will be done on that spring's dawning day. So with that wording, this gives the magic and your intentions a timeline, which would be from Samhain to May Day or the first day of spring. You're welcome to change that if you want. Some folks don't like to give magic a time period, but I do. So just make sure you keep your journal and reflect on these seeds you've planted when the first day of spring comes, okay? And see how your seeds have sprouted. And just remember that magic is not a band-aid. For example, you want to say you want to lose weight, as one of your seeds, but then you spend all winter long eating junk food and staying sedentary. Well, by the time spring rolls around, you're not going to have lost weight, right? So the point is that you have to do the work alongside the magic. Weight is just the first thing that came to mind. So as long as you stay open and dedicated to your spiritual orchard that you've planted, perhaps once like spring rolls around, you find that you've actually found a beautiful walking trail right beside your house and you walk there every morning, and maybe that exercise is something you didn't do before and you've lost a couple pounds just by walking, and you find that like that seed has actually come to fruition. And it's small, but it's there, right? You just have to stay open to this magic coming in the way that you need it to, as well as open to actually doing the work that you need to do in order to get you the results that you want. And again, weight is just the first example that came to my mind because it's easy to make metaphors around, but it can be for whatever the things that you are that you want to bring to fruition, okay? Just make sure you actually make space for the magic to work, and you make space for yourself to get there. You have to be open to the changes needed in order for that to come into your life. You have to energetically be willing to match what you're looking to change in your life. Because if you aren't clear and ready, you may find that your magic comes in a completely different way than you'd imagine. And that goes for all of your magical workings, regardless of what you're working them for, okay? And lastly, I just want to remind you that being ready for a magical working, being ready to bring these intentions into the world, can sometimes just be like being willing to do what it takes. So be open to change. Be open to the possibilities. All right? Okay. Now, lastly, I want to leave you with a couple of journal prompts that work with Grandmother Apple's energy. And you can simply journal about these prompts, or you can ritualize them by grounding yourself and asking Grandmother Apple to join you in your space. All right? And help illuminate the truth from within you. And you can do this by taking a moment to invite her in, by eating an apple, drinking apple tea, lighting an apple candle, or just simply conjuring an apple in your mind. However she comes to you and you're ready and willing to take her in, do that. Savor the flavor, the texture, the scent of her, and embrace the vibrancy of Grandmother Apple, and the vibrancy of her fruit, the mystical nature of her history, her branches. Take it all in. Think about it all while you're either eating her, drinking her tea, or breathing in her scent, okay? And when you've really got apple in your energy, call upon her and genuinely thank her for her loving support to humanity for so long. And once you're grounded into that energy and that thankfulness, invite her to sit with you while you do this journaling activity and ask from your heart for her support. And once you've done this, then you can begin to journal about any of these 3 prompts that I have for you, or all of them if you'd like. And that's just how I would ritualize it if I was going to be inviting Grandmother Apple in with these prompts. But you could also just sit and journal with them. You don't have to do that as well. All right, so here's your prompt 1, okay? Imagine you're sitting across from your inner child, and without allowing yourself to question your gut reaction, how old is your inner child that's sitting across from you right now? Go with whatever number just came to you first, okay? What do you see when you look into the eyes of this younger version of you right now? Ask this version of you what they need right now and see what they say. How does this need reflect to your current experience? Your inner child is a paradox, both ageless and not. Take a moment to reflect on the fact that within you is an inner child that will remain young and innocent forever. How does that make you feel? Now tell your inner child that you will always be with them. How does it make them feel? Take a minute to talk to them and or write out this exchange and what it may be like between you two now. Once you've done that, think about what you can glean from your inner child's reaction to you telling them that you're here for them always. How does this reaction of your inner child show this child's, at this age's, deepest vulnerability? And how does that reflect to how you are treating yourself right now? Are you honoring this or are you pushing it away? Reflect now on how you could make action with this knowledge and hug your inner child before you move on to the next prompt. Prompt 2. Identify now 3 core values that you have for your life at this moment. These can be positive, negative, or neutral. Have you shown devotion to these values this month? Why or why not? Journal about that now. Have you created stories that pull you away from these values? If so, reflect on the threads to where these stories began to weave themselves into your psyche. Try to do this and replace judgment with curiosity as you do. Okay? Take a couple of grounding breaths before you move on to the next prompt. Prompt number 3. Do you have ambitions that you're scared to admit to yourself? If so, take time to write in a stream of consciousness style and explore what limiting beliefs or stories you tell yourself about these ambitions in relation to yourself. Try and actively release emotions that arise while you do this and focus on just getting the stream of consciousness onto the paper. The only objective here is letting it flow to the page. Take a moment after and ground and release, okay? That's all I have for you in this episode, folks. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Wish. Thanks for sticking with me, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye now.